August 1943, Southwest Pacific Theater. The morning sun climbs over the Solomon Islands like a copper disk, emerging from black water. In the dispersal area of Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, a young American pilot named Lieutenant James Crawford stands beside his P-38 Lightning, running his gloved hand along a peculiar patch on the aircraft's aluminum skin. The patch isn't metal, it isn't riveted. It's fabric, ordinary fabric, bonded to the fuselage with what the ground crew calls that stupid glue. The adhesive smells faintly of bananas and chemicals, an oddly domestic scent in a place where death arrives daily at 400 miles per hour. Crawford doesn't know it yet, but this ridiculous-seeming repair, this improvised marriage of cloth and metal held together by a substance the mechanics joke about, will bring him home alive when a Zero's cannon shells rip through his cockpit over Bougainville in 3 hours' time. Across the Pacific, in workshops and depots and carrier hangars from Australia to the Aleutians, other crews are performing the same seemingly absurd ritual, gluing fabric patches onto aircraft worth more than most men will earn in a lifetime. The pilots mark it, the engineers defend it, the enemy doesn't understand it, but the stupid glue keeps working, keeps holding, keeps saving lives in ways that no one predicted and everyone needed. This is not a story about the heroes who made headlines. This is a story about the invisible substance that kept those heroes airborne. The invention that would save thousands of pilots was never meant for war. It was conceived in failure, born from industrial desperation, and named with the casual indifference of men who had no idea they were creating salvation in a tube. In 1937, at the research laboratories of Goodrich in Akron, Ohio, a chemist named Waldo Semin was trying to solve a problem that had nothing to do with aircraft or combat. He was attempting to develop a new adhesive for bonding rubber to metal in the rapidly expanding automotive industry. The automotive giants wanted better seals, stronger bonds, lighter vehicles. What Semin created instead was something the company executives viewed with barely concealed contempt: a yellowish synthetic polymer adhesive that remained permanently flexible after curing, never achieving the rigid strength that metal-to-metal bonds required. It was too soft, too elastic, too weak for industrial applications. The substance was designated Compound B2 and filed away in the catalogue of interesting failures, one more promising experiment that didn't deliver what the market demanded. No one imagined that this weakness would become its greatest virtue. By 1940, as German panzers rolled through France and the Luftwaffe blackened European skies, the United States military faced a crisis of scale that would have seemed fantastical just 2 years earlier. President Roosevelt's call for 50,000 aircraft annually, a figure that drew gasps and skepticism even from supporters, meant that American industry would need to produce more warplanes in 4 years than had been manufactured in the entire history of human flight. The engineering challenges were staggering. Aircraft were becoming faster, flying higher, enduring greater stresses. They were also becoming more vulnerable. The thin aluminum skins that kept weight down for performance offered little protection against enemy fire, flak fragments, or even the violent stresses of high-speed maneuvering. Battle damage turned advanced fighters into flying coffins. A single bullet hole could spread into a structural failure. A shell fragment could peel back metal skin like the lid of a sardine tin. The traditional repair method, cutting out damaged sections and riveting in metal patches, worked well enough on the ground. In forward areas, in jungle airstrips carved from hostile terrain, on carrier decks pitching in heavy seas, it was a nightmare. Riveting required specialized tools, trained personnel, time, and workshop conditions. The process was noisy, labor-intensive, and slow. An aircraft damaged in morning combat often remained grounded for days, while armorers painstakingly drilled out damaged sections and installed reinforcing patches. In theaters where air superiority hung by a thread, where every operational aircraft could mean the difference between holding a position and losing it, those grounded planes represented a hemorrhaging of combat power the Allies could not afford. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics put out an urgent request to material science laboratories across the country: find a way to make rapid, field-expedient repairs to aircraft skin that could restore structural integrity without the weight, complexity, and time requirements of traditional methods. The solution needed to be simple enough for a mechanic with basic training to apply under combat conditions, strong enough to hold under the extraordinary stresses of aerial combat, and light enough not to compromise aircraft performance. Someone at the Naval Aircraft Factory in Philadelphia remembered Compound B2. The first tests were conducted with the assumption that they would fail. Engineers at the Philadelphia facility took panels of aircraft-grade aluminum, deliberately damaged them with hammers and drill bits to simulate battle damage, then covered the holes with ordinary cotton fabric impregnated with Siemens failed adhesive. The fabric was pressed into place, smoothed down, and left to cure. The test panels looked ridiculous, sleek military aluminum patched with what appeared to be someone's bedsheet and bathroom glue. The engineering team prepared their reports on why this wouldn't work, enumerating all the obvious reasons why fabric couldn't possibly substitute for metal in a structure that needed to withstand 400-mile-per-hour winds, extreme temperature fluctuations, vibration, and combat stresses. Then they mounted the panels in a wind tunnel and began testing. The patches held at 100 miles per hour. They held at 200, at 300 miles per hour, faster than most aircraft of 1940 could fly. The fabric patches remained bonded, flexing slightly with the airflow but showing no signs of delamination or failure. When engineers subjected the panels to temperature cycling, from sub-zero cold to scorching heat, the adhesive's flexibility proved ideal. It expanded and contracted with the metal rather than cracking or losing adhesion, as rigid epoxies did. When they deliberately tried to tear the patches off, the fabric itself often failed before the bond did. Test after test produced the same unlikely result. The stupid glue worked. By early 1941, the substance had acquired its wartime designation, methyl methacrylate adhesive, type an F4. The men who used it called it dope, or speed patch, or simply that glue. Its components were relatively simple to manufacture, requiring none of the rare materials or complex processing that made other advanced adhesives impractical for large-scale military use. Better still, the application process was so straightforward that mechanics could be trained in an afternoon. Clean the surface, cut fabric to size, apply adhesive, press patch into place, smooth out bubbles, wait 30 minutes for initial cure. The repaired aircraft could return to flight status in 2 hours. The implications revolutionized aircraft maintenance doctrine. When Lieutenant Robert Scott arrived at his squadron's base in China in late 1942, he expected to find the cutting edge of American air power, gleaming fighters maintained with precision and sophisticated equipment. What he found instead looked like an aircraft boneyard held together with hope and ingenuity. The Flying Tigers and their successor units were operating at the end of supply lines so tenuous that critical spare parts sometimes took 3 months to arrive. Mechanics were cannibalizing wrecked aircraft to keep others flying. The P-40 Warhawks that challenged Japanese air superiority over China were a patchwork of improvised repairs, mismatched parts, and field expedients that would have horrified stateside inspectors. Half the aircraft in Scott's squadron carried fabric patches. He learned the reality of combat aviation quickly. On his third mission, escorting C-47 transports over the hump to Kunming, his P-40 took a burst of light machine gun fire from a Japanese Ki-43 that came screaming out of a cloud bank. The bullet stitched a line across his left wing, punching half a dozen holes through the aluminum skin. Scott managed to shake the enemy fighter and limp back to base, certain that his aircraft would be grounded for days, while armorers cut out the damaged section and fabricated a metal patch. He watched in disbelief as 2 mechanics repaired the wing in 90 minutes. They cleaned the punctures, cut strips of cotton fabric, applied the banana-smelling adhesive, and smoothed the patches into place. One mechanic told him the wing would be stronger than before. The flexible patch would actually distribute stress better than the rigid aluminum skin, making the area less likely to crack under repeated flexing. Scott didn't believe him. He flew the aircraft the next morning anyway, because the mission schedule didn't care about his skepticism. The patched wing performed flawlessly. He put another 200 combat hours on that P-40, and the stupid glue patches never failed. When Scott finally rotated back to the States in late 1943, his aircraft carried 37 fabric patches, each one representing a moment when the quick repair method had kept a combat asset in the fight, instead of rotting on the ground waiting for conventional repairs. The German pilots who encountered American aircraft over North Africa in 1943 noticed something peculiar. The enemy fighters and bombers they damaged in combat had an unsettling tendency to appear in the sky again within days, sometimes within hours. This violated the German understanding of aerial attrition warfare. Damaged aircraft were supposed to require extensive repair time. The mathematics of air combat depended on this. Even if you didn't shoot down an enemy plane, forcing it to withdraw with battle damage removed it from the operational count for a significant period. The cumulative effect of damage over time was supposed to grind down enemy air strength as surely as kills. But the Americans weren't following the script. Luftwaffe pilots reported shooting up B-17 bombers badly enough that they trailed smoke back to their bases, only to encounter what appeared to be the same aircraft, identifiable by nose art and individual markings, over the target again 2 days later. Fighter pilots swore they had put cannon rounds through the wings of P-38 Lightnings, saw pieces fly off, watched the enemy aircraft flee trailing vapor, then found themselves dogfighting the same marked aircraft within the week. German intelligence officers initially dismissed these reports as cases of mistaken identity or pilot error. Then they began finding evidence in crashed American aircraft and captured ground personnel. The Americans were patching aircraft with fabric and glue. Fabric and glue on combat aircraft. It seemed like precisely the kind of crude, unsophisticated approach one would expect from a nation whose engineering culture was supposedly inferior to German precision and methodology. The Luftwaffe technical bulletins that circulated the information carried an implicit tone of smug superiority. Look at what the Americans have been reduced to, repairing their aircraft like children gluing together broken toys. What the bulletins didn't include was context that would have troubled German strategic planners. The reason American aircraft could be repaired with such primitive-seeming methods wasn't desperation. It was abundance. It was the American industrial philosophy of pragmatic solutions and rapid iteration, the same mindset that was producing Liberty ships in 4 days and training pilots in 6 months. The stupid glue represented something the German war machine, for all its technical sophistication, couldn't easily replicate: the ability to accept good enough solutions that worked immediately over perfect solutions that required time and resources the battlefield didn't provide. Every aircraft that returned to combat duty within hours instead of weeks represented a multiplier of American air power that didn't appear in any order of battle calculation. The Germans were counting aircraft production numbers and kill ratios. They weren't counting the invisible reserve of damaged aircraft that American maintenance doctrine was keeping in the fight through methods that looked ridiculous but worked perfectly. On the escort carriers operating in the Pacific, where deck space was measured in feet and every square inch had to serve multiple purposes, the flexible patch adhesive became as critical as ammunition. The small escort carriers, baby flat tops in Navy parlance, had been designed for anti-submarine patrol and convoy escort, not frontline fleet operations. Yet by 1944, they were being pushed into increasingly dangerous roles, providing close air support for amphibious landings, where their aircraft faced intense anti-aircraft fire. The fighters and torpedo bombers operating from these cramped decks came back torn and punctured with disturbing regularity. Aviation Ordnanceman Second-Class Marcus Webb worked on the USS Kitcun Bay, a Casablanca-class escort carrier that supported the late Gulf landings. He later described watching his maintenance crew patch an FM-2 Wildcat that had been hit by ground fire over late. The aircraft had taken a 40 mm anti-aircraft round through the rear fuselage that punched a hole the size of a dinner plate. By conventional doctrine, that aircraft should have been struck below deck and either extensively repaired or stripped for parts. Instead, Webb's crew cut fabric from a damaged wing they'd been cannibalizing, mixed up a batch of the methacrylate adhesive, and had the Wildcat ready for the next morning's strike. The pilot who flew it, Lieutenant J.G. Kenneth Holder, brought it back with 3 more holes from ground fire. They patched those too. That single aircraft flew 23 combat sorties off the Kitcun Bay before the carrier withdrew from the Philippines campaign. 11 of those sorties were flown with fabric patches holding the airframe together. Webb remembered the smell above all else, that distinctive fruity chemical odor of the curing adhesive, mixing with aviation fuel, paint, ocean salt, and the acrid residue of gunfire. It became the smell of survival, the olfactory signature of aircraft being kept alive through improvisation and chemistry. He could walk through the hangar deck blindfolded and tell which aircraft had been recently patched by that smell alone. It meant someone had come back alive and would go out again tomorrow. The adhesive worked so well under carrier conditions because of the same flexibility that had made it seem useless for industrial applications. The constant vibration of a carrier deck, the flexing of the hull in heavy seas, the temperature extremes between the tropical sun and the cool lower decks, all of these conditions would cause rigid adhesives to crack and fail. The methacrylate compound flexed and absorbed these stresses. On several occasions, aircraft took hard landings that buckled their airframes, yet the fabric patches held even as surrounding metal deformed. The patches couldn't restore structural strength to badly damaged frames, but they could seal and stabilize damage that would otherwise have turned an aircraft into scrap. The substance saved lives in ways that extended far beyond simple mechanical repair. In the European theater, where heavy bombers faced savage attacks from Luftwaffe fighters and intensive flak over defended targets, battle damage often created secondary lethality factors that killed crew even when the primary damage was survivable. A shell hole in the fuselage wasn't just a structural problem. At 25,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures, it was a source of catastrophic heat loss and hypoxia. Waist gunners and radio operators in B-17s and B-24s often suffered from exposure when their compartments were open to the screaming wind by flak damage. Men died of cold before their aircraft could descend to warmer altitudes. Others passed out from oxygen deprivation when damaged fuselages couldn't maintain pressurization. Ground crews began carrying emergency patch kits on bomber bases, and flight engineers were trained in rapid patching procedures. When bombers returned from missions with the telltale pockmarks of flak bursts and fighter attacks, the first priority was often to patch holes in the crew compartments, not for structural integrity, but for human survivability. A quick fabric patch over a fuselage hole could save a dozen bombers on the next mission from having their crews suffer cold injury or oxygen deprivation. The patches became life support systems, transforming damaged aircraft from flying coffins back into survivable crew environments. Staff Sergeant Harold Nash, a flight engineer on a B-24 based in Italy, described a mission to the Ploesti oil refineries in April 1944, where flak damage opened a 3-foot tear in their aircraft's waist compartment. The temperature inside plummeted to 40 below zero. One waist gunner lost consciousness. Nash and another crew member managed to stretch an emergency fabric patch over the worst of the tear, using the adhesive from the emergency kit stored in the flight deck. The patch wasn't pretty, and it leaked air around the edges, but it cut the wind and cold enough that they could keep the gunner alive until they descended to warmer altitudes over the Adriatic. The aircraft flew 42 more missions before being retired. Nash kept a piece of that patch in his logbook for the rest of his life, a 3-inch square of cotton fabric and dried yellow adhesive that had saved a 19-year-old kid from Kansas from freezing to death at altitude. By 1944, the flexible patch adhesive had become so integral to Allied air operations that its production was classified as a critical war material. Chemical plants in Ohio, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania ran round-the-clock shifts producing the compound, which was shipped to every theater of operation in standardized kits containing the adhesive, hardener, application tools, and pre-cut fabric patches in various sizes. The kits were simple enough that even relatively inexperienced personnel could perform effective repairs with minimal training. Forward operating bases that lacked sophisticated machine shops could still maintain high operational readiness rates as long as they had patch kits and skilled hands. The substance's strategic importance became clear during the preparations for D-Day. The Allied air forces supporting Operation Overlord would face the most intense air-ground campaign of the European War, with thousands of sorties flown daily against German positions, transportation networks, and reinforcement routes. The planners knew that aircraft attrition from flak and ground fire would be severe. Conventional repair methods would create impassable bottlenecks. Every aircraft waiting for metal patches was an aircraft not flying ground support for the troops fighting through the barcage country of Normandy. In the 3 months before the invasion, the RAF and USAF stockpiled over 50,000 emergency patch kits at bases throughout southern England. Maintenance crews drilled on rapid damage assessment and emergency repair procedures. The doctrine was clear. If an aircraft could be patched and returned to service within 4 hours, it was patched. If repairs would take longer, the aircraft was cannibalized for parts to keep others flying. The stupid glue had become the cornerstone of an entirely new maintenance philosophy that prioritized operational tempo over perfectionism. In the first month after D-Day, Allied tactical air forces flew over 60,000 sorties supporting ground operations. More than 40% of the aircraft involved took some form of battle damage. Without the rapid repair capability the adhesive patches provided, historians later estimated that Allied sortie rates would have declined by 20 to 30% within 2 weeks, a reduction that could have allowed German armored reinforcements to reach the battlefield in decisive numbers. The unsexy, unglamorous substance that smelled like bananas kept the air cover overhead, while young men fought through hedgerows below. The Japanese understood the threat but couldn't effectively counter it. Intelligence officers who examined captured American aircraft or interrogated ground crew prisoners learned about the patch repair method and reported it up the chain of command. But the Japanese military-industrial complex, already straining under resource shortages and strategic bombing, couldn't pivot to produce equivalent materials in sufficient quantities. Japan's synthetic chemistry industry was less developed than America's, and the raw materials required for methacrylate production were increasingly difficult to obtain as the Allied blockade tightened. More fundamentally, the patch repair philosophy represented a difference in operational culture that Japan couldn't easily replicate. Japanese maintenance doctrine emphasized meticulous restoration of damaged aircraft to factory standard condition. Pride, precision, and perfection were valued over speed and pragmatism. The idea of covering a damaged fighter with cotton fabric and glue would have struck many Japanese aviation officers as unworthy of their service's traditions. The Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and later wrote extensively about his experiences, noted with frustration how American aircraft seemed to multiply despite heavy losses. His memoir describes repeatedly damaging enemy planes only to face seemingly identical aircraft days later. He attributed it to American industrial capacity, never fully understanding that much of what he was seeing was the same aircraft, patched and returned to service, while equivalent Japanese aircraft sat grounded awaiting proper repairs. This cultural and industrial disparity created a hidden asymmetry in the Pacific Air War. American and Japanese pilots might be evenly matched in skill. Their aircraft might be comparable in performance, but when battle damage occurred, and in sustained combat it always occurred, the American aircraft returned to action while the Japanese aircraft waited. Over months and years, this invisible advantage compounded into American air superiority that no amount of pilot courage or tactical skill could overcome. The mechanics who applied the patches developed a folk culture around their work, in the way that men in war always create meaning from the tools and rituals of survival. Some crews named their patch kits, others marked particularly good patches with small signatures or dates written in grease pencil on the fabric before applying it, creating hidden archives of battlefield repair that would remain invisible beneath the patches until the aircraft was eventually scrapped. On some squadrons, successfully patching an aircraft back into flying condition within the 2-hour target window earned a mechanic an extra beer ration or a day pass. The patches themselves became objects of professional pride. A really well-done patch was nearly invisible at 10 feet, smooth and taut across the damaged area, edges perfectly feathered into the surrounding metal. There was practical wisdom embedded in this craft. Experienced crews developed techniques for different types of damage. Small punctures from rifle-caliber fire got single-layer patches. Larger holes from cannon shells required double-layer patches with overlapping edges for redundant strength. Very large damage, anything over a square foot, often got reinforcement strips bonded beneath the main patch, creating a fabric and adhesive structure that approximated the strength of the original skin. The best crews could look at battle damage and estimate within 5 minutes how long the repair would take and whether the aircraft would be ready for the next mission cycle. Crew Chief Master Sergeant Anthony Balasco, who maintained P-47 Thunderbolts with the 56th Fighter Group in England, described the satisfaction of sending a patched aircraft back into combat as similar to giving a wounded soldier back his rifle. The aircraft trusted you to restore it. The pilot trusted you to keep him alive. The mission trusted you to keep metal flying. When an aircraft you'd patched came back from a mission with the pilot waggling his wings in salute before landing, the fighter pilots thanks to the ground crew, you felt the pride of having done something real and consequential in a war full of abstract destruction. But the stupid glue couldn't solve every problem. Aircraft that took catastrophic damage, frames twisted beyond tolerance, control surfaces destroyed, fuel systems shattered, were beyond saving through clever patches and quick cures. The substance could seal and stabilize, it couldn't resurrect. Crews learned to make brutal triage decisions, identifying which damaged aircraft could be saved and which needed to be stripped for parts. Sometimes those decisions were agonizing. An aircraft that had carried a crew through 20 missions would come back shot to pieces, and the crew chief who had maintained it from the beginning would have to accept that no amount of patching could return it to service. The stupid glue worked miracles, but it wasn't infinite in its capabilities. There were also the failures, though these were rare enough to be memorable when they occurred. Patches that had been applied improperly, surface contamination, insufficient adhesive, air bubbles in the bond, sometimes failed in flight, usually by peeling back in the slipstream rather than catastrophically separating. Pilots learned the distinctive sound of a patch beginning to fail, a buzzing flutter that changed the aircraft's vibration signature. Standard procedure was to reduce speed immediately and return to base. Most such failures were survivable, but they reinforced the importance of proper application technique. The lives saved per unit calculation for the adhesive ran into the thousands, but it only worked when applied with care and skill. In the final year of the war, as Allied armies closed on Germany and American forces island hopped toward Japan, the cumulative impact of the adhesive patches became visible in ways that statistics alone couldn't capture. Aircraft that had been flying since 1942 were still operational in 1945, their airframes hidden quilts of fabric patches layered over 3 years of battle damage. Some B-17s flying their final missions over Germany carried patches dating back to North Africa in 1943. Fighter aircraft on their 200th combat sorties bore patch upon patch in areas that had been damaged, repaired, damaged again, and repaired again. The stupid glue had kept them alive through a volume of combat that would have grounded them under any previous maintenance doctrine. When the war ended, and aviation historians began analyzing the factors that had contributed to Allied air superiority, the adhesive patches rarely made it into the popular narrative. The public wanted stories of heroic pilots and technological breakthroughs, of Mustangs and Spitfires and daylight precision bombing. The unglamorous reality that a chemical compound originally rejected as an industrial failure had multiplied Allied air power by 20 to 30% through improved maintenance didn't make for compelling cinema or memorable speeches. But the pilots knew, the maintenance crews knew, the strategic planners who had watched sortie rates hold steady despite heavy attrition knew. In post-war debriefings and after-action reviews, the rapid repair capability enabled by the flexible adhesive was repeatedly cited as a critical advantage that had allowed Allied air forces to maintain operational tempo that the Axis powers couldn't match. Lieutenant James Crawford, who had begun this story standing beside his P-38 on Guadalcanal, running his hand over a fabric patch held on with stupid glue, survived the war. The patch he had been touching that August morning did indeed save his life 3 hours later, when 0 cannon rounds shattered his cockpit. The flexible fabric patch across a previous repair absorbed and distributed the stress of the new damage in a way that rigid metal would not have, preventing catastrophic structural failure long enough for Crawford to nurse his crippled fighter back to Henderson Field. He flew 87 more missions before rotating home in early 1945. His final aircraft carried 21 fabric patches, more patch than original skin in some sections, a flying testament to the humble chemistry that kept men alive. In his later years, Crawford kept a small vial of the adhesive compound on his desk, obtained from a military museum that was disposing of obsolete supplies. The chemical had long since degraded, turning from yellow to brown, losing the banana smell that had marked so many wartime repair stations. But he kept it anyway, this physical remnant of the invisible advantage that had multiplied American air power through nothing more sophisticated than flexibility, pragmatism, and the willingness to trust that something simple could work. The stupid glue saved thousands of pilots not through revolutionary sophistication, but through practical elegance. It worked because it was simple enough to apply under combat conditions, strong enough to hold under operational stress, and flexible enough to adapt to the thousand unpredictable ways that aircraft get damaged in war. It represented a philosophy of warfare that America had embraced almost instinctively. Perfection is the enemy of good enough, speed is a force multiplier, and sometimes the most important innovations are the ones that don't look impressive, but quietly keep working when everything else fails. The story of World War II is told through the great battles and strategic turning points, through the names of generals and presidents, and the dates that marked invasions and surrenders. But beneath that narrative of large forces and grand strategy runs a quieter truth. Wars are won by the accumulation of small advantages, the compounding of marginal gains, the unglamorous technologies that let armies sustain operations while their enemies cannot. The stupid glue was one of those small advantages. It never made headlines. No one won a Medal of Honor for applying it. It smelled like bananas and looked ridiculous and worked perfectly, and it helped win a war. In the museums today, the restored warbirds that survived the conflict sit gleaming in their original paint schemes, their aluminum skins polished to mirror brightness. Most of them still carry their patches, hidden beneath layers of restoration paint, invisible to the tourists who photograph them. The mechanics who applied those patches are mostly gone now, and the pilots who trusted their lives to cotton fabric and chemical adhesive have faded into history. But the substance endures, a reminder that salvation sometimes comes in forms that seem absurd until the moment you need them, and that the tools that save the most lives are often the ones we barely remember to mention when we tell the stories afterward. The stupid glue saved thousands of pilots. It held together more than aircraft skin. It held together the operational tempo that ground down enemy air forces through sheer sustainable presence. It held together the invisible reserve of damaged aircraft that kept coming back to fight. It held together the confidence of men who flew into lethal skies, knowing that even if they were hit, even if their aircraft took damage that should have been fatal, there was a chance, a good chance, that someone with a patch kit and steady hands could put them back in the air before the next mission briefing. That was the real miracle of the stupid glue, not that it was technically advanced or theoretically perfect, but that it was there when it was needed, that it worked when lives depended on it, and that it kept working day after day, mission after mission, until the last aircraft flew its final sortie and the long war finally ended. The substance that saved thousands was never supposed to work at all, but it did, and that made all the difference.